Hello there, everyone. It's Tuesday, March 17th. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Father Thomas Aquinas here up in Blessed Sacrament Parish in Seattle, Washington. We have a kind of a cloudy day, but it's still bright enough, so that's great. Hope you're all doing well, and not for those of you that are quarantined or under shelter or something like that. Hopefully, life is not too boring for you. We made our first video yesterday, which I think went okay. I kind of blathered on for a bit, and somebody suggested that I should start this video with a joke. So here we go. So this guy, he went to Rome. He came back and he went to his barber to get his haircut. And the barber's like, "Wow, you went to Rome? How was it?" And the guy was like, "Yeah, it was great. Alitalia was a delightful airline. The restaurants were just incredible. The hotel was pretty classy, and I even got to meet the Pope." And the barber's like, "Wow, you got to meet the Pope?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I even bent down. I got to kiss his ring." And the barber said, "Wow, that's incredible. Did he say anything to you?" And so the man said, "Yeah, he said, 'Where on earth did you get that crappy haircut?'" Pretty good, huh? Yeah, that's from my secret stash of jokes. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, we can start getting into it. I was thinking today we could talk about one of my favorite topics, which is St. Thomas Aquinas on the virtue of religion. Now, some of you who know me might know that I'm a little enthusiastic about the virtue of religion. So, this is what you get. You get more virtue of religion. And what I'd like to talk about today is basically the question, well, what is religion? What is that? When somebody says that they're religious, what does that mean in a Thomistic sense? And how does this apply to the rest of our life as a Christian and as a person? And I think it's helpful to look in St. Thomas Aquinas that St. Thomas Aquinas addresses the idea and the concept of religion through two different angles, especially in his systematic works. But they dovetail, of course, very nicely. The first angle of approach you can see in his work, the Summa contra Gentiles, the Summa against the Gentiles. Okay, and the other work, the other angle of approach he takes is in the Summa Theologia or the Summa Theologica, the summary of theology. And although they work together in the overall thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, they are different in a certain sense. The Summa contra Gentiles has more of kind of a tone of explaining the reasonableness of the faith. So that's why, for example, a lot of people refer to this as more of a philosophical thing that St. Thomas Aquinas is doing. Whether you agree with that or not, it's up to debate. But the Summa contra Gentiles has four parts to it. The first part has to do with simply just kind of God. Can we know the truth and God, especially kind of based on natural reason? The second part of the Summa contra Gentiles is on creation. Okay, so what can we know about the world around us that comes from God? The third part of the Summa contra Gentiles is on providence, which is how does God order and move and guide creation? And then St. Thomas gets into specifically about how does God move and guide human beings. And of course, we know as Thomists that there's no contradiction between providence and predestination and human free will. But maybe we can get to that another time. The fourth part of the Summa contra Gentiles, St. Thomas gets into the more specifically kind of faith content kind of things, although it had been present in the earlier parts. The fourth part of the Summa contra Gentiles is where St. Thomas will start talking about Trinity, about Christ and the Incarnation, about how that worked, also about the sacraments, and and finally about the resurrection. And the entire tone of the Summa Contra Gentiles is more to help Dominicans learn how to be able to argue and to explain the faith in a reasonable way to those who are outside of the Christian faith. That's one way, a generic way of looking at the Summa Contra Gentiles. It's a lot more kind of ad extra. The other work, the Summa Theologia, or the Summa Theologica, has a lot more to do with training Dominicans to know the faith themselves, to know theology. St. Thomas refers to it as kind of the beginner's guide to theology. It's so that Dominicans who study that work can know how to preach well and with orthodox content, and also to be able to hear confessions very well. There's a huge moral component that gets expounded and expanded upon in the Summa Theologia. So, for example, if you were to look at the Summa, I have here a nice addition. So, for example, the first part of the Summa is about God, the inner life of God, and kind of the life of God flowing out into creation, and that part's this big. Okay. The second part of the Summa is so large that it had to be broken into two parts. This is the second part of the Summa. The first part of the second part and the second part of the second part. It's a big, big section. And what does that have to do with? It has to do with human actions, with the moral life. The first part of the second part of the Summa has to do with kind of human actions in general, starting with the fact that we desire happiness. That's kind of the goal of the moral life, is that we all desire happiness. And then St. Thomas' wonderful treatise on what that looks like. What is happiness? And then he'll get into, for example, generically talking about habits. He'll talk about what virtues are, what vices are. He'll talk about how does law fit in all this? How does grace fit into all this? How does temptation? Where's the devil play a role? And looking at, the treatise on grace, for example, all of the treatises in the first part of the second part are just wonderful. I love the treatise on grace in particular. The second part of the second part is where St. Thomas takes all those general ideas of the moral life and he starts applying them very specifically. That's why the second part of the second part is so large. Here's the first part of the second part, the general. The second part of the second part, the specific. Okay, so when you're looking at the second part of the Summa, you're looking at you zooming in really closely onto human actions in particular. And in the second part of the second part, you'll see virtues in particular, along with all their little parts and subdivisions, and then also their opposing vices. You'll look at the gifts and the fruits of the Holy Spirit that go along with them, as well as the Beatitudes. And finally, at the end of the second part of the second part, you'll get the fun stuff, which is it's all fun, I think. But you get the treatise on the gratuitous graces. For example, things like prophecy. St. Thomas has a big emphasis on prophecy. And then also the things that pertain to humans in the religious state. What is you find his treatise on religious life in the end of the second part of the second part. The third part of the Summa, which unfortunately St. Thomas didn't get finished because he died, is basically on Christ and then on the sacraments. So we can ask ourselves, if St. Thomas is going to talk about religion, about what he means religion by the word religion, where do you think in those two works you'd find them? Okay, where do you think you would find religion in the Summa Contra Gentiles? And where do you think you would find religion in the Summa Theologia? Okay, if I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. Okay. Meanwhile, I'm going to have a sip of my mate. Refreshing. So, in the Summa Contra Gentiles, that more kind of ad extra work, the more philosophical work, if you want to call it that. It's debatable. Um, but even that's debatable. It's debatable whether it's debatable. And then the Summa Contra Gentile is, where do we find religion? We find religion in the third part, which is has to do with providence, with how is God moving and guiding everything. And part of that movement and part of that guiding of everything, in that part we find religion. So St. Thomas, let me pull up my. I'll just use the English edition today because it's a little easier, and I can read a little more quickly. St. Thomas starts off the third part of the Summa Contra Gentiles by pointing out that everything is ordered towards an end. Every action has kind of a natural resting place or natural kind of end. And so he basically makes the point that, well, everything, if you looked at everything in the universe, everything acts for an end. Every action is for some sort of goal or telos. And ultimately, what is that ultimate goal of everything? It's going to be God. God himself creates everything, which means, and that's an action, okay? And so God would have to act for an end. God would have to act for a goal. Well, what's the best goal that God could act for? Money? No. Pleasure? No, he's already happy. To get more powerful? No, he's already omnipotent. To learn things? No, he's already omniscient. Why on earth would God create anything? It's basically, it's for his own glory. God creates everything so that everything could manifest and participate in his own glory. And that's why in providence, God created the universe with a whole bunch of different things into it. God's glory is more clearly manifest in the diversity of things, not only the diversity of species, but even in the diversity of states of perfection of the universe. The universe kind of glorifies God. The glory of God is kind of the goal of creation. And, if you're a Calvinist, you might I like that idea, soli Deo Gloria. Give God the glory alone. And yeah, absolutely right. To God be the glory. And so St. Thomas will say here, is that everything is ordered towards God as its end. And everything, in a certain sense, attains God to the degree that it becomes perfect, to the degree that it becomes realized and actualized, to the degree that its being is replete, just kind of like God's being is absolutely replete. And so there's this one line here, and this is like this is a beast of a paragraph. So if you have a Summa Contra Gentiles with you, you can mark this. This is Book 3, Chapter 18, Section 5. Okay, now listen to this. This is Aquinas on beast mode. Okay. Moreover, the effect must tend toward the end in the same way that the agent works for the end. Now God, who is the first agent of all things, does not act in such a way that something is attained by his action, but in such a way that something is enriched by his action. For he is not in potency to the possibility of obtaining something. Rather, he is in perfect act simply, and as a result, he is a source of enrichment. So things are not ordered to God as to an end for which something may be obtained, but rather so that they may attain himself from himself, according to their measure, since he is their end. God orders all things to himself, not in order to gain anything, but so that things may gain him. Yeah, that's the third part of the Summa Theologia, chapter 18, 5. So everything in the universe is ordered towards God. The squirrels, the galaxy clusters, electrons, little microbes in your eyelashes, the coronavirus, everything is ordered towards God as its end, whether we like it or not. And in that ordering to God, we also find humans. Humans aren't outside of the realm of creation. We're part of creation. We're part of how God makes things, which means that we're part of God's moving of all things back towards us. We are meant to be ordered towards God as to our end. But because we are a little different from other creatures, and we're different especially through our intellect, this means that our order towards God and our attaining of God has to involve our reason. It has to involve choice. It has to involve knowledge. So if we go further on in the Summa Gentiles, we start to see that in chapter 115, article 3, we'll start to see that St. Thomas says that the kind of plan, the providence of God for creation, which we can also call a law, that law is meant to move us towards God. And so St. Thomas says, this is Summa Gentiles, chapter 115, article 3, or section 3. Law is a rational plan of divine providence in its governing capacity proposed to the rational creature. But the governance of God as providence conducts individual beings to their own ends. Therefore, man is chiefly ordered to his end by the divinely given law. Now, the end for the human creature is to cling to God, for his felicity, his happiness, consists in this, as he argued earlier. So the divine law primarily directs man to this end, that he may cling to God. And this, for St. Thomas, this order, this movement towards clinging to God, takes on a moral quality. It takes on a quality that we have to choose, and we have to choose to do it. Unlike a rock, which God just kind of moves through its kind of rock-like qualities, God moves us through our human qualities, and those qualities involve our reason and will. So what do we call our reason and our will when they're applied to being directed to God? What do we call it when we choose to be directed to God as to our end and to cling to Him? That is what we call religion. Religion is the order towards God as to an end by a rational human, by a rational creature. And the specific actions, when we order ourselves, we call that worship, or we call that cult. Okay. Now, in technical language, cult, like in English, we think about cult, we think of like people dancing in the woods with like feathers and something like that. That's not what we mean by cult here. Cult here, we're using a special way, which is worship. Okay. So St. Thomas will say in Summa Gentiles, chapter 119, article 6, you'll see he says this. Now, the cult of God is said to consist in these bodily manifestations to God. For we are said to cultivate those things to which we devote effort through our works. Indeed, we show our zeal in regard to God by our activity, not of course to benefit Him, as we are said to do when we cultivate other things by our actions, but because we approach more closely to God by such acts. And since we directly tend toward God through interior acts, we therefore properly give cult to God by interior acts. Yet exterior acts also pertain to the cult of God, according as our mind is lifted up to God by such acts. So we worship God primarily interiorly. Okay, we are ordered towards God interiorly, but because we're also creatures with bodies, we have to use our bodies. We have to use our senses because we learn about God, according to St. Thomas, from observing creation. For St. Thomas, we don't have innate, inborn, clear ideas of God. We have to learn from our senses, from our learn around it, from the world around us. So religion involves not simply interior, but also exterior actions by which we are ordered towards God, by which we're able to draw closer to God, as St. Thomas says. And then he goes on to say in section 7 of chapter 119, also, this cult of God, this worship of God, is called religion. Because in some way man binds himself by such acts so that he will not wander away from God. And also because man feels that he is obligated by some sort of natural prompting to pay, in his own way, reverence to God, from whom comes the beginning of man's being and of all good. So religion is kind of the disposition that someone is bound to God. It's almost like being loyal, okay? You're bound towards God as towards your good, towards your end, and towards the one that creates you and moves you in the first place. And this is called religion. Now, in the modern times, we think of religion, we think of like an institution or some sort of like code of beliefs or practices or something like that. Those are kind of secondary, tertiary ways of talking about religion. That's core for St. Thomas. Religion is a moral quality. It's about how you act, about how you choose, about how your life is really ordered. Where are you really going with your life? Religion gives the answer, I'm going towards God. So St. Thomas will go on. There's a wonderful section, chapter 120, in the third part of the Summa Theologia, where we talk about we should offer. There's kinds of worship. Worship involves a recognition of some sort of excellence of something. Okay, for example, if you recognize the excellence of LeBron James, that in a certain sense is a worship. Okay, once again, we're using worship in a different sense than what we might think. Worship implies the recognition of the excellence of someone. And so for St. Thomas, there's a specific kind of worship that we can only give to God. And that excellence is that we recognize that God is the highest. God is the creator. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He is greater than everything. He's the source of all being, the first cause and the ultimate end. That worship, when we recognize that excellence of God, that's called latria. Okay? And so you can recognize the excellence of other things. You can recognize the excellence of your parents. You can recognize the excellence of politicians, if you want, of sports stars, musicians, theologians, everything like that. It's fine to recognize excellence in others, but we have to recognize that there's one type of excellence which belongs to God alone. And we recognize that's what we call the worship of latria. So this also gets into for my friends who are Protestant. This gets into some of the ways that Catholics understand. Well, what are we doing when, for example, when Catholics recognize the excellence of like a saint or the Blessed Virgin Mary? We're not saying that they're God at all. We're recognizing excellence in them that comes from God, but we worship God alone through what we call latria. So you'd find that in chapter 120 of the Summa Theologia, book 3. Yeah. So in a nutshell, in the Summa Theologia, book 3, God moves everything towards himself. And things are moved towards God when they become perfected. And religion is how humans are moved towards God through knowledge and through choice, when we recognize God as our end. The religious person is bound towards God as their destination. Okay? So that's what religion means in that context. So then we can go, by the way, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and start typing. I don't know if I'm being coherent or not, but I'll just keep going because I like the virtue of religion a lot. So we get into the Summa Theologia, okay? Now, remember, the Summa Theologia has these three parts to it. God, you have human actions, and then you have Christ and the sacraments. And various theologians will say that there's a pattern here called exitus and reditus. Once again, this is debatable, but it's nifty. So exitus, reditus, which is that everything comes from God and everything is meant to go back to God. Sound effects. How about that? So the first part is God, everything coming from God. Then you look at the human person in the second part of the Summa, which is how we start getting back to God. And then you have Christ and the sacraments, which are the kind of that by which we are brought into union with God. So where do you think in the Summa Theologia you would find religion? Do you think you'd find it in the treatise on God, on human actions, or on Christ and the sacraments? Well, trick question. We primarily find it in the second part of the second part, when we're looking at human actions in particular. But you can also find it in the third part, because the sacraments, for St. Thomas Aquinas, when we use the sacraments, they fall under the virtue of religion. Okay, but we'll dive into the second part of the second part to see what St. Thomas says about religion. We see, first of all, religion falls under the virtue of justice. Okay, so we have these four cardinal virtues, we have these three theological virtues. For St. Thomas, religion it finds its niche under the four cardinal virtues, specifically under the virtue of justice. That's for various reasons, which maybe we can get into later. But because it's a debatable point, it was a debate. It was a big debate in the medieval era whether worship was part of the theological virtues or whether the cardinal virtues. Because then you get into the question: well, is this something natural or is this something graced? And of course, St. Thomas, being a good Thomas, being a good Dominican, he would say, well, why either or, but we see that there's a naturalness to religion. For St. Thomas Aquinas, there's a natural inclination to worship God. Now, an inclination, though, doesn't mean like an urge, okay? That's a stupid way of thinking about inclination. Cunningham, I think his name is Sean Cunningham, wrote a brilliant dissertation on what inclinations mean in St. Thomas Aquinas, and they don't mean like an urge, but humans have an inclination to worship God, which means that it's part of what is perfective of us is to worship God. And that's on a natural level, which then can be perfected by grace, and it's perfected especially in the sacraments and also through the worship of the new law of Christ and of the church. So religion for St. Thomas falls under the virtue of justice. The virtue of justice has to do with rendering another person their due. D-U-E, not D-E-W, okay? We render someone their due. basically we give to the other person what we owe them. And what we owe them, however, can be different depending on who they are, who we are, depending on the circumstances. But what we owe someone is whatever is going to establish right relationship with them. Okay? So for example, if you're in relation with a merchant, you're going to owe them money in order to get the products. That's what you owe them. If you're dealing with a boss or some sort of superior, what are you going to owe them? You're going to owe them respect. Okay? Or you can owe a whole bunch of different things to different people. It's not always just money. But it's whatever is going to make you in right relationship with that person. It's going to proportion you or order you to them in the right way. So, however, and one of the effects of being ordered in the right way to someone is that you become on the same page. You become there's kind of an equality in the relationship. You become kind of on the same plane with one another because you're in the right relation. However, there are certain relationships that we can never actually become fully proportioned to the other person. We can never rise up to the same plane as them. And these domains fall under specific parts of the virtue of justice, which are called the potential parts of the virtue of justice. And these involve, for example, your relationship with your parents. You can never fully give to your parents what you owe them because you owe your life to them. Same thing with, for example, or like, and this is more medieval, but your king or your emperor. You can't get on the same level as your emperor because your emperor provides the common good for you. He provides order for your order of society. You can't give that back to someone. And finally, you have, guess who? You have God. God is one of these people that you can never, you can't get on the same plane with because he's not just giving you a good like your life or a good like the common good of society. He's the source of all goodness. He's the greatest. He is the creator. And so we can't equate him. We can't get on the same page with him. But we can try. And we can recognize that. We can recognize that he is beyond us. We can recognize that everything comes from him. For St. Thomas, that's what the virtue of religion is about. Religion is trying to give God what we owe him. However, what do we owe him? We owe him everything. So if you want to go to the second part of the Summa, if you have it on your computer, you can also go online to newadvent.org, and in top right there's a section for the Summa. If you want to go to the second part of the second part, question 81. You can find where we're going to start looking at a couple things. Second part of the second part, question 81. Now, if you've never read a Summa article before, we might do a video about that in like the next few days or something, but we're just going to zip through a couple of these points. The first article on the virtue of religion as a virtue in its own right. Does religion regard only our relation to God? St. Thomas says yes. Okay. And here in this section, we find that St. Thomas starts to play with the etymology of the word religion. Okay, so I saw someone earlier post a question about cult, meaning tend to grow. Okay, so when we talk about religion, what are kind of the etymology of religion? St. Thomas says here in the body of the article where he says, I answer that as Isidore says, etymologies. According to Cicero, a man is said to be religious from religio, because he often ponders over and, as it were, reads again, relegit, the things which pertain to the worship of God. So that religion would seem to take its name from reading over those things which belong to divine worship, because we ought frequently to ponder over such things in our heart, according to Proverbs 3:6, in all thy ways think on him. So one of the ways of thinking about religion is taking the etymology for read, or to read again and again, or read more closely. And a religious person is who reads closely sacred texts or sacred things of worship. So, for example, your Bible, missal, the religious person ponders over these things. And we see also, for example, in Psalm 1, the blessed is the man who ponders the way of the Lord, meditates on him. However, St. Thomas then goes on, according to Augustine in the City of God, it may also take its name from the fact that we ought to seek God again, whom we had lost by our neglect. And there's a little parenthetical note here from the translator. St. Augustine plays on the words re-eligere, that is, to choose over again, and negligere, to neglect or despise. So in that sense, the religious person is one who chooses over and over again to seek God. If they fall, what do? The religious person will get back up because they keep seeking God. They bind themselves to God over and over and over again. St. Thomas goes on, or again, religion may be derived from religare, which is to bind together. Think of a ligament, religare. Wherefore Augustine says, may religion bind us to the one Almighty God. However, whether religion takes its name from frequent reading or from a repeated choice of what has been lost through negligence or from being a bond, it properly denotes a relation to God. Now, relation, I think the Latin here is order to God, which is a big point. The English translation is pretty good, but it's good to have the Latin too, okay, because they miss certain things. Religion implies an order towards God. St. Thomas goes on, for it is he to whom we ought to be bound as to our unfailing principle, our source, to whom also our choice should be resolutely directed as to our last end, and whom we lose when we neglect him by sin, and should recover by believing him and confessing our faith. So religion here, however you want to take its etymology, religion for St. Thomas implies the person whose life is ordered towards God. And that order is through trying to give God what we owe him. And what is that? That's ultimately worship. That's a recognition of his excellence. Maybe we can talk about this later at some point, but that implies not simply just theoretical knowledge that God is great, but also kind of affective knowledge. Your will has to be involved. You have to see God not simply as true, but also as good. Because if you don't do that, then you probably don't choose him. You don't choose God unless you actually perceive him as good for you. The next article in question 81 of the second part of the Summa is whether religion is a virtue. And St. Thomas says, yes, you betcha. And his answer, he says, I answer that. As stated above, a virtue is that which makes its possessor good, and his act good likewise. Wherefore we must needs say that every good act belongs to a virtue. Now it is evident that to render anyone his due has the aspect of good, since by rendering a person his due, one becomes suitably proportioned to him through being ordered to him in a becoming manner. But order comes under the aspect of good, just as mode and species, according to Augustine. Since then it belongs to religion to pay due honor to someone, namely to God, it is evident that religion is a virtue. So once again, religion, we talked about, or a virtue. Yesterday we talked about this a little bit. A virtue is something that perfects an interior ability of yours, thinking, willing, choosing, desiring, so on and so forth. And so what is it that's perfected in you when we're calling religion a virtue? It's your interior relation to God, especially through your will, through your choices, and through your recognition of his excellence. And by doing that, you enter into right relationship with God. This doesn't make you equal with God, like other kind of acts of virtue kind of make you equal with someone, but it makes you kind of in the right posture towards God. The religious person, the person who has the virtue of religion, they understand what their stance is before God, what their position is in the cosmos. They recognize the grandeur of God and how they fit in and have to respond to that grandeur. St. Thomas then goes on in the third article, whether religion is one virtue. He says yes. Let's skip that. Article 4, whether religion is a special virtue, whether it's distinct from others. He says yes. Skip that. Article 5. This is a fun one. Whether religion is a theological virtue. This is where we start getting into some fun territory once again, because what do the theological virtues have to deal with? They have to deal with God, right? I have faith in God. I hope in God. I love God. However, what do you do with religion? You worship God. So it seems like religion would be a theological virtue. However, on the other hand, it looks like, and we're not making judgment here yet, but it looks like non-Christians also can worship God. All right? Whether or not it's true worship or false worship, whether or not, according to Augustine, there's demons involved, or St. Paul for that matter, it looks like non-Christians try to worship God, and even up until the medieval era, it was kind of an unknown phenomenon of someone who didn't worship some God, at least at all. There weren't atheists or agnostics in the modern sense back then. So it looks like then religion has a natural aspect, which would make you think of, this might belong to a cardinal virtue. But let's see how St. Thomas answers this question, whether religion is a theological virtue. And this time we're going to go through the objections, okay? Because the objections are very important. But first, we need another sip of mate. Refreshing. Objection 1. And if you're just tuning in, we're reading from the Summa Theologia, second part of the second part, question 81, article 5. Whether religion is a theological virtue. Objection 1. It would seem that religion is a theological virtue. Augustine says that God is worshipped by faith, hope, and charity, which are theological virtues. Now it belongs to religion to pay worship to God. Therefore, religion is a theological virtue. It's a very, very, very precise argument. Objection 2. Further, a theological virtue is one that has God for its object. Now, religion has God for its object, since it directs us to God alone, as stated above. Therefore, religion is a theological virtue. Once again, very neat. Objection 3. Further, every virtue is either theological or intellectual or moral, as is clear from what has been said. Now, it is evident that religion is not an intellectual virtue because its perfection does not depend on the consideration of truth. You're not religious just because you think about things. Nor is it a moral virtue, which consists properly in observing the mean between too much and too little. For one cannot worship God too much, according to Sirach 43:33. Blessing the Lord, exalt him as much as you can, for he is above all praise. So what's left? Therefore it remains that it is a theological virtue. Some nice arguments there. And we're going to have fun when he responds to these. But he cites on the contrary, and this is interesting. Normally, when St. Thomas responds initially to the objections, he cites some sort of authority figure. Aristotle, St. Paul, Isidore, Augustine. This time he just says, on the contrary, it's reckoned a part of justice, which is a moral virtue. St. Thomas is just, no, I'm just going to lay it down here. It's a moral virtue. So how is he going to explain that? Well, let's read on. I answer that, as stated above, religion pays due worship to God. Hence, two things are to be considered in religion. First, that which it offers to God, worship, and this is by way of matter and object in religion. Secondly, that to which something is offered, that is God, to whom worship is paid. And yet the acts whereby God is worshipped do not reach out to God himself, as when we believe God, we reach out to him by believing. For which reason it was stated that God is the object of faith, not only because we believe in a God, but because we believe God. Now, due worship is paid to God insofar as certain acts whereby God is worshipped, such as the offering of sacrifices and so forth, are done out of reverence for God. Hence, it is evident that God is not related to religion as matter or object, but as end, as goal. And consequently, religion is not a theological virtue whose object is the last end, or a moral virtue, which is properly about things referred to the end. Okay? So what we're saying here, there's a lot of talk about object here, object and matter, stuff like that. The matter of an action is kind of like the stuff, or it's kind of like what are you doing? What's it about? The end is like why, to whom, or what's the kind of goal? The object, that's kind of an interesting thing. The object, and I think it's helpful to think of the object in comparison with the objects of our senses. Okay, an object, when we think about our senses, is that which elicits an ability. Okay, so for example, what is it that elicits our ability to see? It's light. Light is the object of vision. What elicits our ability to hear? It's sound waves. If there's no sound, we don't hear. If there's no light, we don't see. And so God is the object of the theological virtues. That means when someone has faith, hope, or charity, it's God himself directly activating something about that person in the powers of their soul, in their mind, and in their heart. So God is the object of a theological virtue. What St. Thomas is saying here is that, well, what's eliciting, what elicits religion? He says is worship. Worship is the object of religion. But when you worship, you always worship someone. Your worship is directed towards someone. So in the virtue of religion, God is the to someone. He is the goal of your worship. And once again, worship implies, going back to the Summa Theologia, worship implies a recognition of some excellence. We recognize the excellence of God. And that's what we're responding to when we worship. And that's what we mean by the virtue of religion. So the virtue of religion is not a theological virtue, but it has to do with it's a moral virtue, which has to do with how we order ourselves towards a goal, towards an end. So St. Thomas responds then in a reply to the objections, and I think we'll stop after this unless someone posts a pertinent question here. Because this is pretty dry stuff, I think. But actually, it's not dry stuff. I love this stuff. This is my bread and butter, the virtue of religion. So I hope you like it too. Reply to objection 1, and remember, objection 1 was that we worship God through the theological virtues. So St. Thomas responds, the power or virtue whose action deals with an end moves by its command the power or virtue whose action deals with matter directed to that end. Now, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, have an act in reference to God as their proper object. Wherefore, by their command, they cause the act of religion, which performs certain deeds directed to God. And so Augustine says that God is worshipped by faith, hope, and charity. So basically what this means is that in a Christian, because we have faith, hope, and charity, that faith, hope, and charity will cause and will command our worship of God. Okay? But we can distinguish between faith, hope, and charity and worship, although they become interconnected. And later on, when St. Thomas talks about the interior acts of the virtue of religion, especially devotion, we'll start to see that there's kind of a reciprocal relationship between worship and charity. The more you worship God, the more you love him. And the more you love God, the more you worship him. So reply to objection 2. And this is the objection that theological virtues have God as their object. St. Thomas simply replies, objection 2, religion directs man to God, not as its object, but as its end. In religion, we give worship to God. Finally, objection 3. Objection 3 was that it doesn't look like religion fits under intellectual or moral, so therefore it fits under theological. St. Thomas's response to this, religion is neither a theological nor an intellectual, but a moral virtue, since it is a part of justice and observes a mean, not in the passions, but in actions directed to God, by establishing a kind of equality in them. And when I say equality, I do not mean absolute equality, because it is not possible to pay God as much as we owe him, but equality in consideration of man's ability and God's acceptance. And it is possible to have too much in matters pertaining to the divine worship, not as regards the circumstance or of quantity, but as regards other circumstances, as when divine worship is paid to whom it is not due, or when it is not due, or unduly in respect of some other circumstances. But the next article, Article 6, in this on the virtue of religion, is pretty interesting also. It's whether religion should be preferred to the other moral virtues. And in Latin, it's more like whether religion is better or excels the other moral virtues. What does St. Thomas says? He says yes. If we take that big step back and remember that the goal of life is to get back to God, is coming from God and being ordered towards him, then if the virtue of religion is that by which we become ordered to God, you bet your boots then it's going to be pretty darn important. It's going to be more important than a lot of other things. In fact, St. Thomas will say that it's so important, it's so high and elevated, that it can actually command and direct all the other aspects of our life. The virtue of religion is like he says it's foremost, so it's like a prince out of among all the other moral virtues. The person who knows how to worship God well knows how to direct their temperance. They know how food, how pleasure fits into the overarching meaning of life. They know how prudence fits in. They know how to make the right kind of decision in their life so that they keep on the path towards God. Um, they know when and how to be brave and what to be brave about, because they know the overarching goal of their life. So if you have the virtue of religion, you have, in a certain sense, the narrative key to your life. You know where you come from, and you know where you're going. That's why the virtue of religion is so important. And I think it's very important, and I'll just kind of close by this more my thoughts about it. I think it's very important to think of religion as a virtue and not simply as an institution or a set of beliefs, because just in today's climate, people get put off very easily by institutions, especially ones that are like powerful or kind of seem hierarchical and stuff like that. People don't like that. It makes them uncomfortable. For good and bad reasons. But I think understanding religion as a virtue, understanding religion as some sort of perfection of your moral agency, as a perfection of what it means to be human, I think that's a more enticing way of thinking about religion, and that's how I think about it. How is the worship of God something that perfects what it means to be human? And on the flip side, you can see that if you don't worship God, then something is really missing from who and what you are. And what's missing is especially order. Remember, virtue has religion has to do with an order towards God. Your life misses order, and order can be understood not only like kind of a direction, but also as a harmony. If you have religion as a virtue, you have harmony, you have clarity in your life, and whether things are good or bad, you know where you're meant to be going. And plus, if you're part of the new religion of Christ, then you also have at your disposal the means by which you're able to be united with God on an intimate level. Not simply in terms of like Lord and servant, but through Christ, you actually do have equality with God. There is the possibility of what's called divinization, because love makes two people like one another. And so if we love God, then we become like him. And you see that, for example, in the Theology of St. John. Anyway, kind of rambled on long enough. If you thought this was interesting, let me know, and I'll keep doing stuff like this. If you thought it was boring as all get out, just tell me, maybe choose something else to talk about. I'm going to be here. I'll try to do these every day, but I can't make any promises. As long as people are quarantined, might as well give them something to do, okay? Might as well give me something to do also. All right. Well, stay healthy, keep praying, and pray especially today for the virtue of religion, so that your life may be a harmonious order towards the true God. All right. God bless you. Take care.